Question 3. A century in certain ways is like a life. And as the end of a century approaches, people behave toward that century much as someone who is nearing the end of a life does toward that life. So just as people in their last years spend much time looking back on events of their life, people at a century's end blank. Alright, so you notice which of the following most logically completes the argument. So we have an argument completion question. And argument completion questions are really just like must be true questions. Because if it's asking us what logically completes the argument, logically completes means that it follows logically or must be true. So therefore, we're picking an answer choice that completes the argument based on what was included in the rest of the passage. So as you notice, this passage is comparing a century to a life. And how? Well, as the end of a century approaches, people behave toward that century much as someone who is nearing the end of their life is going to treat that life. So just as people in the last years spend much time looking back on the events of their life, people at a century's end spend much time looking back on the events of the past century. You notice that that logically completes the argument. Because if I'm analogizing the way people behave towards the end of their lives to the way people behave toward an end of a century, and I say at the end of their lives they spend much time looking back at the events of their life, well, therefore, at a century's end, these people will spend much time looking back on the events of the past century. You notice that that follows logically. It logically completes the argument. So these are really a subset of must-be-true questions. So now we're looking for the answer choice that restates this idea that they spend much time looking back on the events of the past century. So let's take a look at A. Reminisce about their own lives. And clearly A is out because that is what people do toward the end of their lives. The end of the passage here is what they're doing at a century's end. B, fear that their own lives are about to end, again, does not follow. Nothing about that in the passage. How could that logically complete the argument? So B is out. C, focus on what the next century will bring. And again, no, we're looking back or reminiscing on the events of our lives. So therefore, at a century's end, we would look back on the events of the century. Not about what next century will bring or what a future life would bring, if there is even this idea of reincarnation. Right? That is the idea of C, and again, does not logically complete this argument. Which brings us to D, become very interested in the history of the century just ending, and you notice that logically completes the argument, basically restating the idea that they spend much time looking back on the events of the past century, right? The history of the century that just ended. So D here would be the correct answer as it logically completes this argument. If we're analogizing between the end of a person's life and the end of a century with the way that they treat the end of their lives by looking back on the events of their life, well, therefore, at the end of the century, they would look back on the events of the past century or the history of the century just ending. But again, just making sure, checking E, reflect on how certain unfortunate events of the century could have been avoided. And again, it's not about looking back to things we wanted to change. It's just about looking back on the events of one's life and then analogizing to the events of the past century.